Now we are at the stability of mundane beings. According to, I guess, a traditional explanation, is that it's a world full of sentient beings who do not observe morality. They don't believe in morality because they lack good roots, according to Buddhism. So they don't believe in the law of cause and effect. And they believe that their mundane state of being is the ultimate. So there's no motivation to achieve a supreme state of being like enlightenment. And they don't want to be liberated from their impure and lowly states of existence due to limited understanding. And of course, that does not resonate with the sages. Therefore, there are no sages around them to encourage them. So the more that they believe in their own way of being, the farther they are away from the sages. And therefore, the result is that this has become an impure land. Right? It's opposed to a pure land. Pure land is inhabited by sages, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas. So it's very obvious that we don't need further explanation of impure land if we observe what's around us. But it doesn't mean that we're out of luck. We still have the Buddha's teachings. We still appreciate the value of Buddhism. So that's important. We can see that in Sukhavati, the residents there, the Bodhisattvas, the Arhats, they have good roots, infinite merits, virtues, and they have perfect conditions for them to achieve perfect enlightenment. And they're able to traverse the universe to perform all kinds of skillful deeds. They make offering to the Buddhas, right? Throughout the universe, we are really unfortunate that we don't have one Buddha. We only have the historical Shakyamuni Buddha and the Buddhas that Shakyamuni Buddha has left for us. And the Bodhisattvas in the Western Pure Land, they traverse the entire universe to cultivate merits by making offerings to the Buddhas and to cultivate wisdom by listening to Dharma lectures. Right? So when you make an offering to a Buddha, the Buddha will return with your Dharma teaching. Right? So what we want to talk about is why the conditions that we are in and the importance of morality. Morality being the very fundamental step in Buddhism to achieve enlightenment, right? The threefold studies: morality, concentrations, and wisdom, right? 三学, tam học, giới định tuệ, 戒定慧. So you will see that morality is very important and we should appreciate it, not in a form of restricting ourselves. When people hear about precepts, they think of restrictions, but that's not what it is meant here. And we should appreciate that a little bit more because that will help us towards our path, on a path towards enlightenment. So there are two kinds of morality in general: natural morality and conventional morality. When we talk about morality, we're talking about precepts. And in Sanskrit, it's called sila. And those are, you can say, guidelines to help us to achieve a state of skillfulness and towards the enlightenment. So sila, there's a distinction between conventional and natural morality. If you break a sila that is connected with natural morality, there will be karmic consequence. But not, given that all factors are equal, if you break a sila, which is a matter of conventional morality. So one has karmic consequences, the other one is just a break in tradition, not necessarily resulting in karmic consequences. For instance, if you steal, from somebody, that is a natural morality, because the craving that causes you to steal, then that will have karmic consequence. But if you happen to be wearing your robe in a different color, separating from everybody else, you're breaking a conventional morality, but there is no karmic consequence for that, not necessarily. It just happened, you don't know the rules, and so you happen to be wearing the wrong color. Unless you have strong feelings of greed and attachment for that color, then that will have karmic consequence, right? Or if you wear color of your robe as a egoistic statement, as a way to rebel against the order, then that will have karmic consequence. Doesn't make sense, right? So there's two. And so it helps to know the difference so that we don't beat ourselves up for nothing, right? Just because somebody's yelling at you for wearing different color of a robe. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't know. But there will not be a karmic consequence. Yeah, technically you're wrong, but there's no harm in that in the future. So just correct your way and move along. So a lot of things that we think as natural morality are in fact just conventional morality. Sometimes you go to an order, a monastery, and they say you should do this, you should do this, you should bow in a certain way, otherwise you have sins, then not really, right? It depends on the culture. Some, like in the Eastern culture, you see a monk, you bow, and in some Theravada traditions, they expect you to prostrate down to the ground, and if you don't, that's a sin. And if you're in the Western society, people don't expect you to bow to them. A handshake would do. It's enough to have that friendly greetings, right? But so to say, if you're a Westerner and you go to an Eastern country and you see a monk, you shake the monk's hand. The monk may look at you weird, but you're not breaking any natural morality, right? It's just different cultures. But to say you don't, you didn't bow to the monk, that's a sin. You're gonna go to hell. Well, not really, right? Not really. Observing morality can be conflicting because, especially you don't understand the meaning behind it. Because there can be a conflicting interest between dana and sila. Dana is generosity, giving, bodhi, bushi, and sila is, we say precepts, right? Observing the precepts, 止业, right? 持戒. For example, Santideva is a very famous master, and he wrote a lot of books. He said that there can be a potential conflict between giving and observing precepts, but this can be resolved if you do things mindfully with your thought, reflection, and care and awareness. Because the world is very complex. Not everything comes to us easily. When we try to study Buddhism, it's not very easy. If it was, everybody would have become a Buddha, right? And those where the challenges are, and that's also where you surpass or you succumb, you fall. And it's because of not understanding the meaning behind sila and how to observe precepts, how to 止业, 持戒. So if we don't know how to keep the precept, observe the precepts, we will restrict ourselves. And so Santideva is saying, don't worry about it. You will have conflicts, you will have challenges. But if you do things mindfully, have awareness, with care and reflection, then you will be able to resolve those conflicts. Because those conflicts will hold us back. We will not be able to advance. And they will make us feel sometimes terrible about ourselves because we think that we may have violated something and we're going to go to hell for that. So it helps to understand why we're doing this. That will help us to overcome barriers. Because sometimes those things, the bad feelings that we have for not living up to expectations are just conventional. They're not really anything. It's just our wandering false thoughts that we amplify the problem. But a person looking at it say, don't worry about it. It's nothing. It's just conventional. It's not, you didn't do anything wrong, really, right? So for example, that the conflict between giving and observing precepts, sometimes they oppose each other, right? They don't go, if we don't understand carefully. That Santideva gives an example, a monk encountering a woman who is seriously ill. In the monastic rule, a monk cannot touch a woman, cannot be close to a woman. But if she needs help, she's ill, she needs medicine, she needs something to take care of, if he were to observe the precept, he couldn't be near her. If he were to take care of her, he would be violating his precepts, right? So there is a conflict. That would mean that he would jeopardize his practice of sila. He would violate the precepts. But Santadeva says, never mind, just keep up with it, keep up your awareness, be mindful all the time, and you will be okay. You'll be able to resolve that problem. Know why you're doing this. I'm doing this out of my compassionate heart to help somebody, not because I want to violate the precepts. And some of the monastic rules were quite strict. And one would think one would have restricted the bodhisattva's activities. You want to go out and help people, but then if you're not willing to join them conventionally, and you want to be separated from them, then you'll be restricting yourself. You'll be restricting your bodhisattva's activity. You won't be able to fulfill your bodhisattva's vows, for example. So, for instance, there are rules about not preaching the Dharma to people wearing turbans or carrying swords. The bodhisattva, through the strength of his feeling for giving doctrine, like bodhi fa bu shi, might well disregard these rules. So technically, he would be breaking certain silas of the monastic law. But the bodhisattva vow saying you go out and help all sentient beings, treat everybody equally. If there's an opportunity to help them, even though they may look differently, but you go and help them because they have the potential to become Buddhas. And so depriving them the opportunities to become Buddhas is a serious violation. They may look different from us, but it doesn't mean that we should deprive them from the opportunities to become a Buddha, right? So Santideva, in a way, is saying, conflict will arise, but never mind, be mindful, be aware in everything you do, and even everything, and then everything will work out with regard to dana and sila and everything else. So if there's a conflict, you have this mindfulness, you understand why you're doing this. Is this proper? Is this the right thing to do with the bodhisattva spirit to help people? If this is truly going to be beneficial to them, then never mind, go on and maintain your awareness and help them, right? So that's from Santadeva's perspective. Or there's another genuine conflict, and we often see this, is for those who try to observe a monastic rule in the diet. They don't eat afternoon. After 1 o'clock, they don't eat. But sometimes not everything flows smoothly, especially if you are a busy professional or if you're involved in a Dharma assembly where there are a lot of activities and your help is needed. Sometimes your help is needed throughout the whole day, and you may even have to work through lunch. So then what are you going to do? You already have sign up to observe the precept that day to not eat after lunch, but your help is needed. So that is a real conflict, and that can bring a lot of headache to those who observe that rule. And this is a real conflict. So you can either ignore the rule and eat after you finish with the activities, because at that time your help was urgently needed, so you may decide to ignore the precepts and just continue to help and then eat later. Or if you are strong enough, then continue to fast until the next morning. So there are a couple of things you have to decide what you're capable of and what is your spirit of observing that precept and your aspiration. So sometimes you have to take the meal because either your body requires the meal, or due to medical situations, whatnot, your personal situation. So you have to observe your body as well. When you observe precepts, make sure that you're not putting your body at risk, right? So that's more of a Mahayanic approach, is the spirit of the teaching and not the letter of the law. Santideva, again, is saying that one is mindful all the times. Such conflicts will not only be resolved, but will not be experienced as conflicts. We will not beat ourselves up because we think that we have violated precept. But if we keep our mindfulness, we have this awareness, we know why we're doing this, then Santideva says the conflicts will be resolved, right? So precepts are not meant to restrict us in our lives. They are more like principles and rules of training. They're more like guidance to help us to achieve happiness in life and to avoid suffering for ourselves and others. So it's not to restrict ourselves to not do this, not do that, but we should understand that when we observe the precepts, we are paving our way towards true happiness, self-control, happiness for ourselves and others. It's more like a user's manual of life, right? When we buy an instrument or equipment, a piece of equipment, it comes with a manual, so it helps us to how to operate. So when we are born into this world, it didn't come with manual, right? We wish that it came with manual. That would have been much easier. But life didn't give us a manual. But luckily, the Buddha's teachings is a manual to life, so we can use it. So these precepts are meant to help us, to guide us to achieve towards that state, the state of happiness for ourselves and others. And so precept is not restriction, but more a principle. It's principle of ethics. And that principle of ethics is foundation, principle being the foundation of life. And as long as our foundation is strong, then we will have a strong, firm life. Meaning that whatever we do, our happiness, our self-confidence, our state of mind will be firm, right? As long as you stick to the principles, you have strong foundation, then you're on the right path. Right? Of course, it has to be the right principles. So a typical set of precepts is the set of 10 precepts. We often talk about 10 precepts. 10 precepts or 10 silas are 10 kusala kama patas. They have different names, but the content remains the same. They are about the same. There are 10 of them. Kusala means kusala, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but it means skillful, 停, like 停业. Kusala, 善业. So kusala karma is 善业, skillful karma, skillful actions, skillful deeds, skillful thoughts, skillful speech. So kusala karma is 停业, 善业. The 10 silas can be found in Nikaya Sutras, the canonical sources of the 10 precepts. Especially the Anguttara Nikaya, you can find them in you can find the 10 precepts in the canonical sources. So the 10 precepts is essentially abstentions from the 10 akusala dhammas. So the 10 is to prevent us from committing to the 10 unskillful deeds. And that includes observance, practice, or cultivation of the 10 kusala dhammas. Now, every precept comes with the negative form and a positive form. So you can't just say, you should observe both to be complete. And we'll talk about both forms. When it says, don't do this, don't do that, that's negative. But you should do this, you should do that, that's positive. And it helps us to understand too, because if you're only told to not do this, not do that, then you don't know what to do. Because you only know what not to do. You don't know what to do, right? So kusala means skillful, and this term is very important. It means clever, skillful, or expert in in a sense that you know what to do to benefit yourself and others, to bring benefits. So kusala karma is skillful action that direct towards securing both for oneself and others the best possible results in terms of happiness, knowledge, and freedom. So anything that you do that will bring true happiness, freedom, then that's kusala. That's skillful. 停, right? Shan. For example, in constantly mindful of the law of karma, knowing that the reality is painful, impermanent, and insubstantial, that helps us to march towards the path of freedom. Because if you don't understand, you don't recognize that life is painful, impermanent, and insubstantial in nature, then you will either see that as existential or nihilistic. And that leads to attachment or complete detachment, which is in a negative sense, in a very negative sense. But understanding reality will help us to understand the unconditioned nature. We've talked about in the past about condition and unconditioned. These two terms are important, and I think we should explain a little bit more to help us understand. The Western cultures do not have a language for Buddhism, unlike the Eastern culture, right? It has been around for thousands of years, and so there is a language for Buddhism. So these terms are commonly understood. But when you translate those Buddhist terms into English, or Western language, then you kind of lose meaning because they have to pick some words to correspond to the concept, but those words are very unfamiliar to us. But these terms are important. So I thought that it would be helpful to understand what is conditioned and what is unconditioned, because we use those two terms a lot, if you notice. So the unconditioned, condition comes from conditionality, 缘起, or 因可. So those two come from conditionality. Condition here means compounded or put together. They put together. And in Chinese, it's called 有为法 or 缘生. In Vietnamese, it's Pháp hữu vi or Pháp duyên sanh. So conditions are when things are put together. When they are put together, of course, they are conditioned, meaning that when the conditions are no longer there, they disappear, right? On the other hand, unconditioned is uncompounded, not put together. In Chinese, it's called 无为法 or 无生. In Vietnamese, it's called Pháp vô vi or Pháp vô sanh. So there we have two conditioned and unconditioned. The nature of conditioned existence is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and without a self, because we have no control over them. They change whenever they want. When the conditions there, they maintain. When the conditions change, they change as well. We have no say, and that's why they're impermanent, and they are unsatisfactory because they don't follow what our desire. They don't follow our desire. So, and that leads to unsatisfactory, and that is because they have no self. There's no something that is truly intrinsic in it that is not changing. So that's easy to understand conditioned existence, right? This is like this monitor, this table, this microphone. It's conditioned because you have material, you have different constituents inside there to make up that, and you call it a microphone. There is not a single thing that's called a microphone. So that's called conditioned existence. That's easy to understand, right? Nirvana is considered as unconditioned state or thing. We have to put it in quote because it's not a thing. It's not really a state. It's something. It's really beyond language. For us to use that to call it a state is already wrong. It's beyond language, beyond our perception. Nirvana is characterized as not self, 无我, vô ngã. It's also permanent, unchanging, and ultimate bliss. But it's not a thing that is permanent, unchanging, and it's not a thing that can give you, that you can be attached to. You can hold on for ultimate bliss. The question here now is, if nirvana is unconditioned, then is it outside of conditionality? Of course, it's not outside of conditionality. According to the Buddha, there is nothing that exists outside of conditionality, right? The Buddha states very clearly that nirvana is not something that's above himself or the Dharma. It's not above conditionality. But he also made it clear that he did not teach that anything arises without a condition. Right? So if you have nirvana, there is a condition, but we cannot say it's conditional in the sense that it will change. So what does this mean then? So what did it mean for the Buddha to talk about the unconditioned, right? 无为法, pháp vô vi. The answer that the Buddha presents the unconditioned as is when conditions that lead to dukkha have ceased, have stopped. So things that lead to no suffering is unconditioned. It is a purely negative description of a state beyond words or concepts. So we're just using words to help us to understand. Just like the finger pointing to the moon, we shouldn't be looking at the finger, we should be looking at the moon. So don't be too attached, bogged down by words. So let's go on and see how the Buddha describes the unconditioned. Unconditioned can be translated as uncompounded. It's not made of anything. So your state of nirvana, nibbana, is not because of something that creates it. Uncompounded, 无为法, pháp vô vi, or 无生, vô san. The uncompounded experience will be one that is completely simple and pure, not defiled by any adventitious states or conditions. So let's digest this a little bit because it's getting a little bit technical, I can feel. So uncompounded is a state that is pure, that is not defiled. Not defiled by what? This is what the Buddha taught the monks, the term unconditioned. He said, "Monk, I will teach you the unconditioned and the path going to the unconditioned. So listen, what is the unconditioned?" The Buddha asks. The destruction of greed, the destruction of hate, the destruction of delusion. This, monk, is what is called the unconditioned. So when you are in a state of no greed, no anger, no delusion, that is a state of unconditioned. So you can see we're using negative terms to describe it. We have to use some term to describe that state of being. But it's not really a state, because it's, as long as you remove uncompound greed, anger, and delusion, then you have it. Does it make sense? Right? It's uncompounded, 无为, vô vi. It's uncompounded because you don't put together anymore with greed, anger, and delusion. We have this existence, we have this human body because of greed, anger, and delusion. We have greed for existence. So we have this being compounded. But if you remove that greed, the element of greed, then what do you have? You can say you have nothing. You have uncompounded state of being. You have nirvana. You have 无为法. You have vô vi, pháp vô vi. Does it make sense? Right? So uncompounded here, sometimes called unborn, or vô san, or 无生. It's not because it doesn't exist. It does exist in an uncompounded way, if it makes sense, right? So the components that make up this life are greed, anger, and delusion, essentially those three poisons. If you remove that, then you have a whatever you want to call it. In this case, we call it nirvana, a state of no suffering. But so it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's something of its own class, right? Does it make sense? Right? So that's what we mean when we say unconditioned, wu wei fa, pháp vô vi. Okay. So the path going to the unconditioned is subsequently described in several ways. Whether you use mindfulness or insight meditation, xiu guan or du wang, that leads to wisdom, or the Eightfold Path, ba zheng dao, ba zhen dao. So different ways of getting to the state of unconditioned. In this case, unconditioned is synonymous for nirvana. Right? It's a deathless state, it's an aging state, because there are no constituents, no compounds that would degrade it. Right? If you have a desire to live, that is craving. So when you have condition for existence, of course, it's going to break if the conditions are no longer true. But if you have no conditions, uncompounded, then there is no death, right? No death here doesn't mean that you go to a place that you live forever, but you may enter life, but you don't encounter the suffering of death. Death is just like when you go to sleep every day. Some people say every time we sleep and wake up, we gone through death and rebirth in a sense, right? But it's natural, you don't feel the pain. But there are people who cannot sleep. For them, the process of sleep is very painful. Or, they don't have good night's sleep. So for some people, it's very painful to go to sleep. But for some people, it's natural. They don't feel anything. They sleep happily and they wake up in a happy state. So when we are in nirvana, where we don't have greed, anger, and delusion, we may have lives in and out to help people, to come back as a human to help, or to be reborn in the heavens or hells, or even whatever realm. It doesn't matter. To them, it's just natural, because there's no compound of greed, anger, and delusion, right? So when we say a state of deathless, nirvana, it doesn't mean we go to some place and live forever, but it's just a natural, based on wherever we want to go, we go, and it doesn't bother us, right? So if people who don't understand this will see death being very painful and scary. I'm going to lose this life. So what I'm going to do after this life, that is a very scary thought, right? But they understand, hey, this unconditioned state is just another state of existence. So when you lose this one, you get something else better. So we're not attached to something that we have because we think it only exists one lifetime. We think that we will lose this life forever. Okay? So the unconditioned is the state that is uncompounded with any greed, hate, and delusion. It is free from three unskillful roots of action, a state free of all reactive tendency. So unconditioned by any activity, it is purely creative mind. So the author is using reactive and creative. We talked about this last time. Reactive is when you have this sense-based perception, and when you add delusion, you have this reaction towards life to create more karmic consequences. Okay, so essentially, you are pushing this wheel of life and death. It does not stop. So when we use our reactive mind, we are essentially reacting to the world based on the data we receive with our eyes, our ears, our nose, our taste, with our senses, and we react whether we like or we hate. Right? So we react. So this is reactive mind. This is not good. What we want is creative mind. So when we say don't have reactive mind, doesn't mean you don't think. You stop thinking. You stop interacting with the world. That's not what it means. You continue to interact with the world, but you do it in a creative way. And the creative way here is to be mindful. Right? It doesn't mean you stop interacting with the world, but to be mindful in your interaction. And this is how we break the 12 chains of conditionality. Right? That 12 chains of conditionality from delusion to volition, all the way to birth, old age, and death. And it continues. We break this cycle of life and death with our creative mind. It's not to not think, to stop thinking, to put our heads in the sand like an ostrich. That's not what it means. You interact with the world and you break that chain, that cycle, by using your creative mind. Does it make sense, right? So it is a state of calm and clarity. And this is what the Buddha said. Just as in the midst of mountains there was a lake whose water was clear, transparent, and undisturbed. So standing on the bank, someone with eyes might see oysters and shells, gravel and stones, and shoals of fish on the move or stationary. So when we have this, when we are truly in a state of unconditioned existence, or unconditioned, we can see life very clearly. It's not to not see, but we see life. People moving, traversing from hell to heaven and back to a human realm and so forth. You can see that very clearly. And you understand the conditions why people move from one place to another. They migrate all the time. And we see why they do that. And sometimes we migrate too, and we know exactly why we migrate. And that's because we have mindfulness. Some people don't have mindfulness is when they use their phone and they flip through videos and they just keep flipping to fill the gap, to kill time, right? To kill boredom. That's unmindfulness. They don't know why they watch it. They just want to watch to keep their mind busy because they're afraid of boredom. They're afraid of not having anything to do to occupy the mind. But here, when we go on the internet, we look for things, we have a clear purpose. We just don't just browse around, surf around, not knowing. When you have this clarity of the mind, you see why things happen. And when you have clarity of the mind, things will happen and you know what to do. You will know what to do. There will not be any conflict. So the term unconditioned here, the Buddha tried to express something that is unexpressible. Right? The Buddha used nirvana, unconditioned, wu wei fa, pháp vô vi, all those terms that the Buddha used to describe something that is not really describable. So the Buddha here, but the Buddha is not ignoring that there is something. He's not saying, if you get to nirvana, there's nothing. I mean, there's something, but you cannot say there is something because it's uncompounded. So here's the Buddha says, there is monks and unborn and become, and there's a Chinese version too, unconditioned, no escape could be discerned from what is born, become, made, and conditioned. But monks, since there is an unborn and unbecome, unmade, and unconditioned, an escape can be discerned from what is born, become, made, and conditioned. So there is something, but we cannot use language to describe it because it's uncompounded. Okay, so I hope that's clear between conditioned and unconditioned, right? Wu wei fa, pháp vô vi. They have different terms like unborn, vô san, wu sheng. So those terms, different traditions use different terms. And when we read different texts and we don't have a strong understanding, it can be very confusing. And so I hope this helps to clarify unconditioned and conditioned because those two concepts are really critical to a study. As you've seen, I've used those terms a lot, and I hope this is helpful. Okay, going back to our normally scheduled program. Talk about kusala. kusala is supposed to help us to move towards unconditioned, right? Kusala is skillfulness. Skillfulness not to restrict ourselves, but to motivate us towards something that's greater than conditioned existence. Kusala is an ethical term. Has to do with ethics, morality. It's a human behavior. So there's a notion of wrong and right, right? So when you talk about ethical, there's something wrong, there's something right. Kusala itself implies that there is a notion of right that conduces to the attainment of enlightenment, and wrong is something that doesn't lead to enlightenment. So kusala in the Buddhist term is not just any good deeds, because if you're, let's say, a drug pusher could help make his customer happy by offering drugs. The customer may be happy, but that's not kusala. That's not healthy. That's not skillful. Right? So it has to be skillful that leads to enlightenment. If it leads to delusion, then you cannot say that help is kusala. That help is skillful, right? So there's different kinds of help, but we want the skillful kind of help. Okay, so kusala is itself the ethical. In other words, when you are, if you are ethical, it doesn't mean it's kusala. It doesn't mean skillfulness. But if you are kusala, then you are ethical. Does it make sense? Because being ethical could be very cultural. It's relative. In a culture where, for example, a few months ago, the tradition was for the adolescents growing up to show their manhood by killing whales, right? So that's expected in that culture, and you will be applauded by killing a lot of whales. You'll be rewarded, but that's not kusala. That's not skillful, right? The 10 precepts that we will talk about really represent the principles of ethics. They are the foundation, so they're the truth. The principle here means the truth. So by observing the 10 precepts, it is not to restrict your life. It's not to make your life a living hell, but to help you to uncover your wisdom, right? Because it's a principle. So they are not rules in a narrow sense. They are not directly concerned with minutiae of conduct. The things that you do, I have to be careful. I have to be careful not to violate. That's not what it means here. Of course, we have to be careful, but that's not the whole point of observing the precept, is to restrict yourself. I cannot do this. I cannot do that. I'm just stuck. That's not what it means. It's more than that. It doesn't concern about the minutiae of the conduct, all the little things that you do. Don't worry about it. Look at the bigger picture. There are more like rules of training towards skillfulness, towards enlightenment, right? Okay, so precepts as rules of training, because they are really steps to help us to get to enlightenment. They're footsteps, they're steps, they're elements, they're trainings to help us to get to enlightenment. So when we observe the 10 precepts, we, in a sense, are opening ourselves up to the ability to learn, to absorb, to change, to transform ourselves. And of course, that is also mean that we receptive to our teachers, to those who pass down the precepts to us. We are capable of observing and putting into practice, right? Observing the precepts and putting the precepts into practice. So when we observe the precepts, we are telling ourselves, I am capable of keeping the precepts, and I'm capable of putting the precepts into practice. The emphasis that we should focus on here is the capability, the learning and the training in accordance with the spirit of Buddhism. So learning here implies that you are willing to learn, and there is somebody who's willing to teach. So it's not something to be learned, but also something to be learned personally from a teacher. So that's why we have this spiritual community that we share. It's not reading a book. Reading a book is fine, but you don't have that personal connection. You don't have the personal connection, the personal teachings are not normally included in books. They're more theoretical. And even though they have specific examples, but sometimes those examples don't apply to us because our lives are different. So when we talk to somebody, when we have this personal connection and we have questions, those questions are for us. And when they are answered, they answer for us. So when we read somebody else's literature, we should understand that those things are not necessarily for us, and they are for somebody else. So that's why the value of spiritual community, to establish the personal connection within the spiritual community, right? Especially with those who are more spiritual advanced than ourselves, then it helps us. So learning the 10 precepts, 十善业, thập thiện nghiệp, those 10 precepts involve a number of things. When we observe the precept, we should understand the meaning behind it and why we're doing this. When we sign up to observe the precepts, we are telling ourselves that we are willing to learn. We can put ourselves aside and willing to receive, willing to learn. So that's one. The second thing we should understand when we observe the precept is to learn how to confess those violations, breaches. Because we're not perfect, we will make mistakes, but we should own up to those mistakes and confess our mistakes. It's called 忏悔, 三悔. Right? So first is to learn to be receptive. Second is to know that we will make mistakes and that we should own up to those mistakes. Third is to correct ourselves, not just admitting our mistakes, but to tell ourselves we will not repeat those mistakes. We will try our best not to repeat those mistakes, right? And the fourth thing is that it helps us to make and keep vows, 发愿, 发nguyện, in a sense of solemn promises to do something, right? To not do this again, or to help sentient beings, to be more generous, whatever it is. We make and keep our vows, right? Based on our shortcomings. Everybody has their shortcomings. If we lack compassion, for example, or generosity, we say we will do our best next time. For example, you see a homeless person on the street. I mean, it's like, I don't want to give $10, but fine, I'll give $2, right? Or I will do more practice. I will practice meditation, if not every day, then at least 5 minutes a day or 2 minutes a day to keep that momentum. So whatever it is that you make vow to be better. So the precepts helps us to improve ourselves essentially, that we don't regress. Okay, so we talked about the precepts being the principles, the truth that help us to move from the conditioned to the unconditioned, right? To move away, to remove the elements of conditioned existence, meaning greed, anger, delusion. Remove those and we will have a state of unconditioned. And precepts being the rules of training, not to restrict us, but to help us on a path of kusala, of skillfulness. The skillfulness is not just being good, but it has to be beneficial and it has to lead to enlightenment for it to be called kusala, shan, right, or thiện. Does it make sense? Right? Now we will go into the main part of the precepts, the 10 precepts. The first precept is abstention from killing. That's the negative form of the precept. The positive form of the precept is loving kindness. So one is to not kill, to not harm. That's not good enough. We have to, express or show or exercise our loving kindness as well. The more important and ethical principle is the more likely that it is will be so obvious as to be overlooked for or neglected. So we shouldn't say that, oh, I already know this, the first precept, yeah, no killing, I already know that by heart. And I don't need to learn it. But we should understand it deeper, because sometimes it's so fundamental that we often overlook, and then we miss the point. Of course, one should not kill human beings or even animals, right? Killing is bad. But the word does make exceptions. The word knows that killing is bad, but it also makes exceptions. Exceptions such as, race, religion, nationality, they kill, right? Or when an animal is wanted for food or sports, right? Animal hunting or sports killing, or when it is more valuable dead than alive, right? So the word, everybody knows killing is bad, but the word does make exceptions to killing. Murder is wrong. It's a crime. It's a sin. Most people assumed that they have never personally killed a living being and unlikely to do so in the future. So they're not really concerned about this precept. Meaning they don't understand it deep enough. They think, oh, no killing. Yeah, I know that. So I'm perfect. I'm perfectly observing this first precept. But if we learn deeper, we will find out that we could be violating the first precept without knowing it. If we don't understand this, then we can just get on with our lives, and we'll never really think deeply about it. And we will miss the point. It will not lead us to enlightenment, because we have no mindfulness in that observance of the first precept, right? So I'm trying to build the scene here, the reason why we need to learn this precept a little deeper than just the surface of no killing, right? The first precept is not to be disposed, of course, in this way. We shouldn't think it that way. The abstention from killing, 不杀生, không sát sanh, runs very deep in life, both social and spiritual, and its ramifications are not only very extensive but enormously significant. So the fact that we observe these precepts, and that when the Buddha says observing this precept has infinite merits in it, and we understand just on the surface, we don't understand why it is such meritorious. I can do this so easily. Why is it so meritorious? And that's because we don't understand that it has huge ramification when we observe the precept. It could be helpful. If we don't observe the precept, it could be very harmful. Not only in the first precept itself, but all other precepts too. So all the 10 precepts, we're going to spend a little time understanding the 10 precept a little bit deeper, so that we can appreciate why the Buddha said that observing the precept can be so meritorious, right? Observing the precept can lead to enlightenment. What's the reason behind it, right? So we'll find out. The precepts are significant, because when we understand the negative form of it, we really don't appreciate it. We see only restriction. So that's why we should also understand the positive form of it, which is loving kindness. So in this precept here, it includes not to destroy life, to slay life, to kill, or to murder, right? And why is killing wrong? Why is killing wrong? Some parts of the world do not think that killing is wrong. So why are we saying that killing is wrong? And they will have to agree with us why killing is wrong, right? So we'll go through the reason why is that they are wrong by committing to killing. And we will understand why here. So one explanation is that because killing is the expression of a mental state rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. It's an unskillful act in a sense that it brings suffering to ourselves and others, and it prevents that person from attaining enlightenment. So that's why killing is wrong, because you are inhibiting yourself of future happiness, and you don't even know it, right? Those people who commit killing, and like sports killing, hunting for fun, for sports, they are depriving themselves for from future happiness, from enlightenment, which is a state of perfection, a state of, the ideal state of being. They are depriving themselves from their ideal state of being. And that's why it's wrong. Because when a person kills somebody, it is to inflict upon the victim, that person, the greatest of all sufferings or evils. And life itself is the greatest good. Because of this life that we're because of life that we have an opportunity to achieve enlightenment. So when life is taken away from us, we are deprived of that opportunity to reach enlightenment. So that's why when life is taken away from that person, that is a violent act, the greatest violence, right, that one can commit. And that is to deprive that person of life, of opportunity to reach enlightenment. This is not only the physical force, but also things such as emotion and blackmail and fraud. So those things, anything that can harm a person, like fraud or something. Even then, you may not be hurting that person physically, but if you're hurting that person mentally, you're also depriving that person from advancing, right? So violence indeed consists in our doing to another person by whatever means what he does not want us to do to him. So violence is something that we do to something that we don't want it to be done on us, right? Since what he least wants us to do to him is to deprive him of life, which being the greatest good is what he most values, to kill him is to commit the greatest violence against him. That it is possible to commit. So this is the greatest violence that anybody can commit, is to take life away from somebody. Non-violence is said to be the highest rule of religion. All religions teach non-violence. The most extreme form of that unethical behavior is to commit to violence, to take life from another person. So killing being the most extreme form of violence, that's why it is wrong. So therefore, we should understand that the first precept is not just no killing, but the deeper significance is that killing is wrong because it represents the extremist form, that the negation of one ego by another. So what killing is, we are negating, we are removing, you are canceling their life, right? And that is an extreme form of violence. Paradoxically, by negating another person's ego, their life, we are also negating our own life. So that's why those who commit to violence would deprive themselves from enlightenment, because by destroying other people, they are destroying themselves too, in a sense that they are depriving themselves from achieving enlightenment, achieving future happiness, right? So killing is a complete rejection of the golden rules. And without the golden rule, there can be no human society, no culture, and no spiritual life. So this is why the first precept is so significant. It's not just a matter of no killing. Oh, I'm not eating meat. Okay, I'm observing the precept. It goes much deeper than that. If we don't observe the first precept, there is no human society, because we are removing life from human. If there's no human society, there's no culture, there's no spiritual life, right? So for us, if somebody removes our life, negates our ego, there's no human, there's no culture, there's no spiritual life. Doesn't make sense, right? So that's why it's very significant. And according to Wikipedia, the golden rule is the principle of treating others as one wants to be treated. It is a maxim that is found in most religions and cultures. So when we say the golden rules, we're saying that don't do to others that you don't want others to do to you. That's the golden rule that everybody observes. In the Dhammapada, Pháp Chư Kinh, Kinh Pháp Cú, the Dhammapada also talks about something similar. It says all living beings are terrified of punishment, all fear death. Making comparison of others with oneself, one should neither kill nor cause to kill. All living beings are terrified of punishment. To all, life is dear. Making comparison of others with oneself, one should neither kill nor cause to kill. Right? All sentient beings, everybody is afraid of death, and they all want to live. And so when we reflect that, then we should understand that that's a lot of suffering to cause if we remove somebody's life. Right? So here the golden rule is stated in negative terms. Right? You should not do unto others what you would not that others should do to you. Stated more positively, you should do unto others as you would they should do unto you. So in other words, if you like happiness, then give people happiness. If you don't like suffering, don't give people suffering. That's, in a sense, that's what it's saying. Abstention from killing represents the golden rule in its negative term. So we're using don't do this, don't killing. That's a negative term. The more positive term is to cultivate loving kindness. That's more positive, right? So the great secret of morals is love, loving kindness, 慈悲, 德悲. Going out of our own nature and identify ourselves with others. When you identify yourself with others, you are making that connection, that human connection. And when you have that human connection, hurting yourself, hurting others is like hurting ourselves. It's just like when you have that connection with a friend or family members, when you see them get hurt, you feel hurt as well. But as stranger, you read on the news, 10 people were involved in a car crash this morning on the freeway, 710. Okay, you have no feeling because you don't know who they are, you don't have that connection. But you see your family's name cited on the report, you will feel hurt, right? So when you have this connection, when you have this identification of yourself and other people, you have that human connection, you will be able to identify with them, and you will be able to cause rise to compassion and loving kindness. A man or a person to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. So when we can do this, we are knocking down the wall of the ego. When we have this wall erected, we cannot see on the other side. Our ego is preventing us from seeing, from connecting with other people. And the Buddha is teaching selflessness, 无我, right? vô ngã. It's not to see our ego as being an entity of itself, but you knock down the wall so you can relate to other people. You can see that somebody's family members were in a car accident, they feel hurt, we would feel hurt. That's why we will try to help them where we can, right? So that's what it means that the pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. Is that it's not that we become painful, but there is compassion in it. We don't get bogged down by the pain, but we have this aspiration to help, to want to help, and not to isolate ourselves and become numb, spiritually numb, emotionally numb. In the book of Santideva, Entry into the Way of Enlightenment, he talks about about compassion, and that one upon the excellencies of solitude should strengthen his thought or will to enlightenment. Putishin, right, Bodhitam. And he says that the practitioner should foster the thought that his fellow creatures are the same as himself. They have the same sorrows, the same joys, and if we guard them, like, therefore we should protect them too. If we're protecting ourselves, then we should protect others. The body is made of different parts, and it must be preserved as a whole, just like the universe with its sorrows and joy in common. We all share this in common. We're on the same boat. So their suffering is also our suffering, in a sense that we want to help them, not to bog us down, right? To beat us down. But we should use that as a motivation to help others. He said that my pain may bring no hurt to other bodies, but the pain is mine. I cannot bear the pain because of the love of myself. Right? So when we love ourselves, we want to protect the body. We want to protect the mind to not feel hurt, to not be hurt, because we love ourselves. So therefore, when we see other people suffering, we should help them to alleviate their suffering, because we love sentient beings. We have this loving kindness. So if you have loving kindness, then you will want to remove the pain of others. I must destroy the pain of another as though it were my own. So not only feeling sorry, but to help them to alleviate the suffering, right? And guard myself from all evilness. I will frame a spirit of helpfulness and tenderness towards others. So it's not only trying to protect ourselves from feeling happy, but to prevent ourselves from being defiled, of evilness, to be defiled from evilness. And therefore we should try to do the same by being helpful, by tendering to their needs. Okay? He said that this body is made of drops of seed and blood, and it's really not myself. So by protecting this body, I'm being delusional, because I'm seeing this body as real entity, and I'm only protecting myself. But it just is a composition of the four elements. He said that we should think ourselves as sinners and others as oceans of virtue, to lower ourselves and to not be arrogant. We love our hands and limbs. We love our body parts. And why not love other living beings? If we love our bodies, and our bodies are the same as the others, why stop there? Why just stop at loving ourselves? But we should expand it to include others, right? It just doesn't make sense that if you have children, for example, they are the same to you in the sense of they are your product, offsprings. So when you love one child and not the other, it doesn't make sense, right? You love all your children equally according to needs. So same thing, our body and other people's bodies are essentially the same materially. And we are the same spiritually, with potential to become Buddhas. So if we love our body, then why don't we want to expand that to include other bodies? That's what Santideva is saying. So we guard ourselves against suffering, then we should exercise the spirit of helpfulness and tenderness towards the world, right? So this is known as the practice of equality of self and others. So Blake is another philosopher. He was a philosopher. He said that the most sublime act is to put another before you. That's selflessness. That's what the Buddha is teaching. Right? That is the greatest act, is to put others before you. Right? To think about other people first. So this is not just a smushy kind of feeling, that's soft kind of sentiment feeling, but it has to be done in a very imaginative way and with dedication, and to identify ourselves with other people. Only when we can identify ourselves with other people can we make that human connection. Can we see their suffering? Can we understand their suffering? Without understanding their suffering, we will not be motivated to help, to be helpful, to tender to their needs. This loving kindness, this love or loving kindness is not erotic love or parental love or even friendly love, but it's selfless love. We help because it's the right thing to do. We don't expect anything in return. We help other people because we see them as ourselves. There's no differentiation. We are all equal in the sense that our bodies are made of the same material and we all have the same opportunities to achieve happiness. If it is love at all, it is cherishing, protecting, maturing love. Just like the sun shining down all physical things. So we should be aspired to have that kind of loving kindness, is to help, to be helpful in wherever that we can, right? So such love or loving kindness is very rare. Selfish love is very rare. Violence is more common. Human beings operate much more frequently in accordance with power mode than in accordance with love mode or loving kindness. We see this all the time, is that a lot of people use power mode to elevate themselves, to make themselves better. And they often forget about the love mode, loving kindness. What is power? What is power mode? Power here means simply the capacity to use force of violence against other people, the capacity to negate, to remove the lives of other people, or to remove, to negatively impact their livelihood, wholly or in part. So to operate in accordance with the power mode means that you use violence to exercise that, to negate rather than to affirm other being, right? To remove them for your own advantage. That's power mode. To operate in the love mode is the opposite. Since every living being, including human beings, has the capacity to use force to however limited an extent, every living being possesses power. Some are more limited than others, but you see animals, they use their power mode to secure resources for their survival. So whether consciously or unconsciously, we apply power mode all the time. Human beings possess more power, both material and mental. So when we observe the first precepts, abstention from killing or loving kindness, not only do we abstain from actual killing, but we should act more in accordance with love mode and less in accordance with power mode. So when we observe the first precept, which is not to negate, to remove life, when we use power mode, we are suppressing their livelihood, right? So in a way, if we do that, we are in a way violating the first precept. So you can see it goes really deep. And if we are unconscious in our act, we use our power, our financial abilities, our social status to suppress somebody. We are using a power mode. We are violating the first precept. Does it make sense? Right? So the power mode here it's really physical power, and it's security and power gained through the physical senses. For example, physical power is financial security. You base on something that's physical to gain that security. You have a lot of money in your bank account. You feel secure. That's physical power, not spiritual power. When you have good connections with friends or law enforcement or higher up, you feel great about it. You feel confident. That is physical power because something that's tangible. And it's the fact that it is tangible, it makes it more accessible and people use it more often. They don't think about love mode because love mode is more spiritual and it's not very easily accessible. You have to be mindful of it for it to come, to show itself. That's why people rely more on physical power and operate in power mode because it's more accessible, right? I feel great because I have a lot of money. I feel pretty because I look nice, or so forth and so forth, because of all the physical senses. So we want to avoid or use less of power mode and more of love mode, right? This work is not that easy. What we have talked so far is kind of theoretical, because but the word is not always easy, and it's very, because it's very complex. So when we are faithful observers of the first precept, to operate all at once in terms of the love mode eschewing the power mode completely is almost impossible, right? For us to operate entirely in power, in love mode, to act in compassion all the time is not possible. So what is the guidance? What's the guideline here? How should we operate in the world? We want to be able to use the Buddhist principles, and not just to learn, but to apply in our life, right? So what is the guideline? So the author proposes 2 principles, but I think they're more like guidelines than principles. One is that power mode must always be subordinated to the love mode, meaning you want to use your love mode more than your power mode. You have 2 to use. You should first try to use love mode, then power mode. For example, like a parent, out of love for the child, will forcibly restrain the child from doing something that will harm himself. So that's power mode, right? You say, no, you're not going to do this. You're not going to hurt yourself. That's power mode. But behind it is love mode. Does it make sense? So, because you cannot always be nice to people. People will misunderstand you and they will step on you. Sometimes you have to exert your power to maintain harmony, in a sense, not to destroy harmony, but to maintain harmony, to preserve harmony. So that's how the word is always testing us. So we have to be mindful of which mode, what we should use. So once we find that power mode is no longer necessary, then we should exercise love mode. Right? The second is that within the spiritual community, it is impossible to act in accordance with power mode. So in a friendly environment, in a spiritual environment, there is no need for power mode. Right? We are here trying to support each other, help each other to advance. Our goal is not to gain physical power, but to achieve enlightenment. So there's no need for physical power mode. Acts of violence between order members are therefore the most serious breach of the unity, right? I mean, that's a really bad thing to do. So besides operating in accordance with power mode only to the extent that power mode is subordinated to the love mode, meaning that when you exercise your power mode, there needs to be a foundation behind it, needs to be the force of love mode, right? The reason you are exercising your power mode is because of the love mode. Does it make sense? Not the other way around. Not just power mode, but the force pushing it behind it is love mode, right? If you remove love mode, that power mode should just drop. It has no effect. The reason it has its effect is moving because of the push, and that push should be love mode. Does it make sense? Right? So that's how I think this is very helpful in how to apply in our daily lives. Right? We learn compassion, but at the same time we also need to exercise discipline of ourselves and other people. Right? It's not just a one-way street, but that is where we gain wisdom. It's through application of what we learn. It's not just reading books, but to learn how to apply it. Because reading books, everything is in an ideal environment. Everything works perfectly in the head, right? But when you walk into the world, it's completely different. So observing the first precept, the author says that will naturally result in one's being a vegetarian. So being a vegetarian doesn't mean you are a Buddhist, but being a Buddhist operating in love mode, observing the first precept, your tendency is to want to avoid killing, to avoid inflicting unnecessary pain, or maybe I should say avoid pain. But sometimes pain is good, but to avoid inflicting suffering on others. And naturally, you want to be a vegetarian. To assist and to encourage others in having, to be concerned about environment, to be concerned about environment. Non-violence or loving kindness is a principle, the rule or a law or the truth. There's no limit to the number of ways in which it can be applied. Right? So being the principle, so it's not just about, I'm not killing, I'm a vegetarian, I'm observing the first precept. That's very limited, because we have to understand, we have to remember that being the principle, there are many ways to apply that principle, right? So the first precept here is to abstain from killing in its negative form. In the positive form is to practice loving kindness. Right? Okay, we've come to the end of our lecture. We will continue next time, and the next time we will talk about abstention from stealing or generosity. So very quickly, just wrap up what we just talked about today is the turbidity of mundane beings. It's a world where beings do not observe precepts, do not believe in morality. And that's what led us to talking about morality. Morality is not just restriction. Precepts are not restrictions, but they are guidance to help us towards the path, on the path of skillfulness towards enlightenment, moving from condition to unconditioned. And condition is compound, made of greed, anger, and delusion. This life is conditioned. That's why there's suffering, there's pain. Unconditioned is when you remove those things. It's not something, just removing those things, then you have unconditioned. So unconditioned is not separated from condition. Unconditioned is the removal of the conditions. Does it make sense, right? And then we talked about the first precept, no killing. No killing is more than just not killing, but to avoid removing life, because that has implications on the human existence, implications on the existence of cultures, society, and spiritual life. So when we observe the first precept, it's not just about a very narrow mind in not killing animals, but we should see on the grander scan that we are preserving spiritual life, right? Because we have that connection. We have broken down the wall of the ego so we can see across the wall. We now have this human connection. Therefore, we have this sympathy, empathy. We understand each other. And that's what eliminates inequality. Right? And that's how we have this human connection, and that's how we have this motivation to help each other, to be helpful, to tender towards others who need help. If you could please join your palms, together we recite, may the merits and virtues accrue today adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss.